Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to be with you again this evening. Thanks for tuning in and signing up to join us for Dartmoor in the Age of the Black Death, an illustrated talk with Dr. David Stone. So we're looking forward to a fascinating talk in a few minutes. So before we get right away into that, let's just do a bit of housekeeping just to make sure that everyone knows what we're doing. The talks usually last about 40 minutes to an hour, something around that sort of time, and then there's usually some time for questions at the end, and we'll see how those go at the end. So probably about half an hour or so for questions. So please use the chat function. I can see quite a few of you have already been saying hello in the chat, so that's great to see you all using that. So if you're signed into Google, use that. If you don't want to sign in, then you can of course send us your questions by sending them to our education@dartmoor.gov.uk mailbox that way, and I'll be looking at those through the evening. So if you see me looking off to the screen, it's because I'm checking on the chat function and I'm checking on the emails. So yeah, we have a great talk for you tonight. I've heard Dr. Stone talk before. He was part of our Moor Medieval project group over the last few years. Part of our Moor Medieval project group, part of the More Than Meets the Eye Landscape Partnership, and we did some fascinating work discovering more about Dartmoor and the medieval period. So I'm hoping that this will all come together in this talk that we're about to share this evening. I can see quite a lot of you have signed in. There's still a few more people I'm expecting, but I think we'll probably sort of make a bit of a start there. Hello, just say a few hellos to the people who've already acknowledged us in the chat. Hi to Amy, good to have you with us. Hi Rodri, hi David, hi MK Para, keeping yourself discreet there, I think. So lovely to have you with us. As I say, just keep asking questions through the course of the night. That will be fab. And if there are any technical issues, you can't hear properly, then probably the chat is probably the easiest way to get in touch and let us know if things aren't working quite as well as they should be doing. So we've got Dr. David Stone with us. As I say, he's been part of the Moor Medieval Study group. So let me just bring him on screen with us now. So hi David, good to have you with us. Are you,
Hi, Andy.
are you in fine fettle for this evening?
I'm not doing too badly, thank you.
Excellent. Well, it's lovely to have you with us again, even if we are sort of in our remote little worlds at the moment. But at some point, it'd be nice for us all to be able to sort of get out and explore Dartmoor and do some face-to-face talks and things, wouldn't it? So
It certainly would be, yeah.
yeah, that'd be great.
It won't be
So
too long.
no, it won't be too long, will it? So, David, I am going to let you do your own introductions and things. I'm going to shrink you down and put your slides on with you, and then I'm going to hand over to Dr. David Stone. Take it away, David.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Andy, and thank you all for being here too. The Black Death refers to the outbreak of disease in Europe in 1346 to 1353 and in England in 1348 to 49. The resonance between the Black Death and the current pandemic is striking. There are, of course, major differences, but some of the comparisons are arresting. The reservoir of the Black Death also lay among wild animals. It spread to humans at a time of climatic change, and it originated in China and arrived in Europe via Italy. European evidence describes the imposition of social distancing in the Italian town of Pistoia, reflects extraordinary claims about the causes of the disease, and reveals an array of contemporary experts confidently prescribing forms of prevention and cure. After the Black Death arrived in Britain at Melcombe Regis in modern Weymouth in the summer of 1348, we can also see the richest in society fleeing to rural properties, local authorities struggling to cope with the sick and the dying, and Edward III's government intervening heavy-handedly in the labour market. It's possible too that there's some evidence from the Middle Ages that Zoom calls originated at the time of the pandemic, as this slide shows, although perhaps that evidence is disputed. What's perhaps most extraordinary about the era of the Black Death is that we can recover so much information about it, not just at a global, continental or national level. Despite the elapse of over 6.5 centuries, we can trace its passage through local communities and reconstruct the impact it had on ordinary people and the economy and society of which they were a part. I'd like to start slightly away from Dartmoor on a lowland estate comprising two manors, King's Kerswell and Dipford. In 1316, when Lord Nicholas de Males died, there were 91 tenants on his estate. His widow Margaret outlived him by 33 years. She died in the spring of 1349, when the Black Death was at its height in Devon. In the wake of her death, the King's Exchequer came to assess these two manors. There were no longer 91 tenants there, but 14. This evening, what I want to do is to look in particular at the arrival of the Black Death, the nature of the disease, and the scale of the mortality it caused. But I'm also going to bookend that by giving you a sense first of what life was like on Dartmoor and the surrounding areas on the eve of the Black Death, and then by looking at the impact of the Black Death in this area. Quite a bit of what I'll say relates to Eastern Dartmoor, as that's the area covered by the Moor Medieval project, but I've also found other documents from the surrounding area on and off Dartmoor that might be of interest. Advancing. There we are. Dartmoor was largely a landscape of isolated farmsteads and hamlets. You can see this through locations referred to in contemporary surnames. On the manor of South Tean, for example, which extended from Chagford across to North Bovey and Morton Hampstead, taxpayers in 1332 included some occupational surnames, names like Potter or Taverner or Taylor, but some locational ones as well. De Throardeston, which relates to Drewston, a settlement on the manor of South Tean towards the right-hand side, to the right of Great Week. You also see surnames like de Westcott, relating to Westcott, just to the west of Great Week. Surnames like Atterthorne, relating to the tenement of Thorn towards the bottom of the map. Other surnames like de Swainthole for Saint Hill towards the east, and de Horslake for Horselake just below Great Week. In some moorside parishes, population didn't change much in the 12th and 13th centuries. But elsewhere, under the influence of a benign climate, these centuries saw significant population growth. There was some expansion of previous settlements, especially on the fringes of the moor, in settlements that were already slightly bigger and that attracted markets and fairs, for example, at Ashburton or Bovey Tracy, Morton Hampstead or Chagford and Chudley. There was also some new settlement, both in lowland areas, for example, at Newton Bushel in 1246, that was when it was founded, and further up onto the moor, beyond the likes of Mannerton Village, for example, at Hutholes in the parish of Widdicombe and Chalacombe in the parish of Mannerton. Chalacombe was both established and went through several phases of expansion in the 12th and the 13th centuries. And this slide shows the view from the main village of Chalacombe, one of the houses that now lays ruined, looking across towards East Chalacombe, just across the valley, showing how settlement grew across the valley in that sense. The house itself here was probably rebuilt in the 16th and 17th century, but is on the footings of an earlier building. The seal on the right, by the way, shows one of the earliest land transfers for which we have a record for at Chalacombe. It's a seal, and it shows the name of the person who is sealing the document, in this case, a man called Robert Barrett. The words around the edge of the seal say, it begins with S apostrophe, then Roberti Barrat. And it looks as though there might be a wolf in the middle, probably representing his noble ambitions rather than any other sort of lupine qualities. The expansion of population on Dartmoor continued right up to the eve of the Black Death. In Dartmoor Forest itself, the number of occupied ancient tenements, as we now call them, stood at 25 in 1300, but 45 in 1348. Population growth was not the only development during this period. People's status was increasingly defined as well. And you see this most clearly in manorial settings. The basic distinction on a manor is between lords who held the manors and their tenants. The land on the manor was divided into the lord's land, the demesne land as it was known, and tenant land. Lords, though, varied in status. In fact, the value of the lord's residential or administrative centre varied considerably from place to place. I've just drawn up a chart here from various places showing the value of the capital messuage, the main house and gardens that a lord would live in for various places on the eastern side of the moor, ranging from North Hall at Widdicombe, valued at only a shilling in the late 13th, early 14th century, right up to King's Kerswell at the top, valued at 20 shillings. Second in the list is Bovey Tracy, which is valued at 6 shillings and 8pence. Here, the lord had a manorial centre, which we're told comprised a hall, a chamber, a kitchen, and a grange. It had a garden of several acres with fruit trees in. And in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a park was also laid out, which you can still walk in. It's the National Trust property of Park, and you can indeed still see deer there. So lords were divided in terms of status, but tenants were divided in terms of status too, not just by how much land they held, but by their legal status into legally free and legally unfree peasants, with many gradations in between. One of the tangible distinctions between free and unfree was the obligation for the latter to perform labour services, for example, ploughing and sowing the lord's land and reaping his crops. Now, unsurprisingly, these were often performed rather grudgingly, as this illustration from the Luttrell Psalter of 1330 suggests. It's the faces of the peasants which are particularly nice. I especially like the chap on the right-hand side, who is not really enjoying his day's work. Now, administering manors produced a wealth of documentation, and these can give you wonderful snapshots of medieval life. The manor of Plympton in the late 13th century was held by the Countess of Devon, a woman called Isabella de Fortibus, and has one surviving account roll for the year 1286 to 7. And this is the top portion of it. I've highlighted the top left-hand bit of it, right on the left-hand side, to show the word Plympton with an E on the end of the way we spell it today. But you can see the beautiful handwriting that these sort of local documents had during this period. This document describes various domestic and service buildings in Plympton Castle. It also talks about 3 mills at Plympton: the East Mill, the Middle Mill, and the West Mill. This is another illustration from the Luttrell Psalter, showing a mill on the left-hand side. You can see its mill wheel there with the leat coming down towards it. And further up the leat, upstream, are some fishing nets, some fish traps. And indeed, at Plympton, we hear about 2 fish traps being bought for the mill race as well. The document also tells us that income was derived from lots of different resources, from tenant rents, from the sale of crops, from underwood, which was cut at Saltram, from pasture of the animals around the castle, from the sales of apples and cider, cheese, leeks and flax that was sown in the garden. Even bracken and heather were cut and sold. The document also tells us something about the lives of the unfree peasants. It tells us about fines for the daughters of unfree peasants' marriage. It tells us that labour services were performed. The Countess gave a total of 18 pence, so that all the bond tenants, all the unfree tenants, had a customary meal at the end of harvest called hook meat. We can also trace what crops these peasants grew and ground at the manorial mills that we heard about earlier. And you can see from this pie chart that over 2/3 of the peasant crops here at Plympton were barley and wheat. But what about Dartmoor itself? How did people there make a living? Well, they also grew crops even high up on the moor. We know this partly because of earthworks called strip lynchettes, and there's a fine set of these strip lynchettes at Chalacombe, which we saw earlier on in the parish of Mannerton. We also know from receipts from the mill at South Tean and Dockham Manor, close to Morton Hampstead, that hardy crops such as rye and oats were favoured on the moor. Rye for bread, but also straw for thatching. The oats was used for pottage and ale. The ale was something of an acquired taste. Southwestern oaten ale was said to taste like wash that pigs had wrestled in. So they grew crops. Peasants on Dartmoor also kept livestock. These included horses, pigs, goats, chickens, peacocks, but most evidence survives for cattle and sheep. If I just focus for a minute on cattle, Dartmoor was the centre, the hub of something called transhumance, the movement of cattle from the lowlands of Devon up onto Dartmoor to graze for the summer. And officials of the Duchy of Cornwall, who owned Dartmoor from 1337, kept detailed records of the numbers of cattle coming up onto the moor to graze. These are called adjustment lists, and I've given you a little extract of one on the right-hand side of the screen. On the left is a picture of Dunnabridge Pound, and during the course of the summer, the livestock, the cattle, would have been herded into pounds such as this, and we know that this one certainly existed in the Middle Ages and may well have existed for centuries before that. But they packed animals in and counted them up and noted who the owners of the different cattle were. The animals were packed in so closely at these times that probably the officials stood on the walls surrounding the pound and maybe even walked over some of the cattle. They were looking for little notches on the ears of the cattle, distinguishing the different owners of the herds. So they drew up these lists, which are shown on the right, and these lists allow us to see many things, not least the role played by the ancient tenements of Dartmoor and the inhabitants of moorside parishes as middlemen, bringing up the cattle up onto the moor and looking after these lowland cattle on the moor during the summer. We can also see from these lists that women as well as men were involved in this process. Towards the top of the list, the second name down is Sarah at a Head, and we're told that she was looking after 21 boves, 21 cattle that particular summer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 names down from her, it says is Tire Capel, Isabella Tire Capel, and she looked after 5 cattle up on the moor that summer. So women were involved as well as men. The evidence for sheep comes mainly from lists of tinners who also kept sheep but were exempt from paying taxes on their wool in the 1340s. Compared to the rather scrappy lists drawn up for cattle, the documents created for tinners who kept sheep are rather more ornate, and this is an example of a list drawn up for the manor of South Tean in 1342. What it shows is that, and it's got the names of the people down the left and the amount of wool that they should have paid tax on towards the middle of each entry. It shows that these tinners mostly had quite small flocks, but it also gives an indication sometimes of where they lived. So we've got a reference, for example, to somebody from Little Week, about halfway down, Robertus de Little Week. Just underneath him, there's John de Westcott, one of the settlements, one of the tenements on South Tean. And 3 names below that, we've got Michael de Meekham, again, one of the settlements at South Tean. And towards the bottom, John at a Ford as well, Ford again being a tenement on the manor. The names themselves also give us an indication that there's some migration to this area during this particular period. The 4th name down is Robertus Cornish, somebody moving to the northeastern side of Dartmoor from Cornwall. Elsewhere on this, not on this particular list, but on the document more broadly, you also see nicknames cropping up for these people. So we've got nicknames like Silverlock, somebody with grey hair. Somebody else had a nickname Batteur, which means they were quite objectionable in terms of their personality. Now, evidence such as this provides a sense that people were doing non-agricultural occupations as well, not just tin working, but also because of the wool suggestions of cloth production. Some surnames too, and the coming back to this list, the 3rd name from the bottom is William Soper de Wick, and he's got 2 surnames there, Soper and Wick, and the word Soper is an occupational surname. He was a maker of soap, quite possibly from the ashes of bracken, which when you burn them become very alkaline. Indeed, there was a growing landless population on the edge of Dartmoor as elsewhere in the country, and they must have relied on occupations and trades such as these, as well as some agricultural labour. Now, it's into this world that the Black Death arrived in the summer of 1348. By contemporaries, the disease was simply called pestilentia, the pestilence. It's traditionally thought of as plague, but some historians and scientists have disputed this on the grounds that it didn't behave like modern outbreaks of plague in the late 19th and early 20th century in places like Manchuria, Hong Kong, and elsewhere in China. They suggested maybe it was an airborne pathogen such as anthrax, maybe it was a hemorrhagic fever like Ebola, or maybe it was an unnamed disease that's simply now died out. However, it's recently been proved unambiguously by DNA extracted from human teeth found in 14th century mass graves across Europe that Yersinia pestis, the plague bacillus, was the causative agent. The origins of the Black Death lie in Western China, well off to the right of your screens. From there, via routes such as the Silk Road, it reached the city of Kaffa on the Black Sea in 1346. Kaffa is just on the northern edge of the Black Sea, to the northeast of Constantinople. It was brought across from China partly by Mongol hordes who besieged the city of Kaffa in 1346, and in an act of biological warfare, as some of their number were dying from plague, they catapulted their dying colleagues over the walls of the city of Kaffa into the city to spread the disease. And it was some Italian merchants fleeing from the city, coming back around the Black Sea via Constantinople, that brought the disease into the Mediterranean and up into Europe. It spread through the Mediterranean and up through France in 1348 and reached Melcombe Regis in modern Weymouth in the summer of 1348. Although plague spread quickly, word of mouth spread faster. People prepared themselves in various ways. They sold crops rather than having their grain just sort of sitting in their granaries. They got rid of it and they put things on the market before things went belly up. They secured barns against looters, and of course they prepared themselves in terms of their souls. The church argued that plague had been brought upon them by the ills of society and the wrath of God. In October 1348, the Bishop of Exeter made everyone confess their sins, pray fervently, and told them to undertake solemn public processions through the city every Wednesday and Friday until Christmas. It wasn't a good decision to stop at that point. The Black Death reached Devon by late autumn 1348. In any community, disease took about 6 weeks to develop, and you start to see plague deaths at Clist Gabriel Hospital near Exeter on New Year's Day 1349, about a week after these processions stopped. I wonder what the bishop thought at that point. We've got some intriguing evidence about the arrival and spread of plague in Devon, which is provided by appointments of new priests to vacant benefices by the Bishop of Exeter. The bishop took to his palace at Chudley for the duration of the Black Death, and new priests from all over the diocese came there to be instituted by the bishop. The dates of these institutions tell us several things. Firstly, that the Black Death arrived initially by sea and river. What this map shows is parishes where new priests were instituted in January and February of 1349. You can see that there's a cluster up the River Exe to Exeter, at Dawlish, up the River Tean to Bishop Stainton, and up the Dart to Totnes, and then into the parish of Ashburton, but also elsewhere around the coast, down near Kingsbridge, and up the Plym around Plymouth. Subsequently, judging by appointments in February 1349, the plague spread up the Tean Valley. We can see on this map that Chudley, Trusham, places like Ashton, Doddescombe, Dunchilliac, and Dunsford all had new priests that month. Secondly, going on to March and April 1349, new priests were appointed at Bovey Tracy, at Ilsington, at Lustley, at Widdicombe, North Bovey and Maniton, suggesting that plague was at its height on the eastern rim of Dartmoor in the early spring of 1349. So plague has moved up right onto the moor itself and is beginning to come across more strongly onto the western side. You can see it sort of encroaching around Tavistock. How did the disease manifest itself? Well, we've got some very good contemporary descriptions of the disease, for example, by a man called Gabriele de Musis. He was an Italian lawyer based at Piacenza, who wrote a description of the Black Death years. He died in 1356, so he survived for 7 or 8 years after the Black Death. And I thought I'd read you a little bit of what he wrote. He starts off in this way. May this stand as a perpetual reminder to everyone now living and yet to be born, how Almighty God, King of heaven, Lord of the living and of the dead, who holds all things in his hand, looked down from heaven and saw the entire human race wallowing in the mire of manifold wickedness, enmeshed in wrongdoing, pursuing numberless vices, drowning in a sea of depravity because of a limitless capacity for evil. He was in no two minds about what caused the Black Death. He goes on, for the rest, so that the conditions, causes and symptoms of this pestilential disease should be made plain to all, I have decided to set them out in writing. Those of both sexes who were in health and in no fear of death were struck by 4 savage blows to the flesh. First, out of the blue, a kind of chilly stiffness troubled their bodies. They felt a tingling sensation, as if they were being pricked by the points of arrows. The next stage was a fearsome attack, which took the form of an extremely hard, solid boil. In some people, this developed under the armpit, and in others, in the groin. Then, as it grew more solid, its burning heat caused the patients to fall into an acute and putrid fever with severe headaches. Then, as it is intensified, its extreme bitterness could have various effects. In some cases, it gave rise to an intolerable stench. In others, it brought vomiting of blood or swellings near the place from which the corrupt humour arose, on the back, across the chest, near the thigh. Some people lay as if in a drunken stupor and could not be roused. Behold the swellings, the warning signs sent by the Lord. All these people were in danger of dying. Some died on the very day the illness took possession of them, others on the next day, and yet others, the majority, between the 3rd and 5th day. There was no known remedy for the vomiting of blood. Those who fell into a coma or suffered a swelling or the stink of corruption very rarely escaped, but from the fever it was sometimes possible to make a recovery. So Disease took several forms with differing outcomes, which more or less fits with our understanding of plague. There are two main forms of plague. The first is bubonic plague. This is transmitted by fleas on rodents, especially black rats, and probably human fleas and lice too. This is what an infected flea looks like. It's that redness in its abdomen, which is the diagnostic feature in terms of it carrying plague. So bubonic plague is not in itself infectious. What happens is that there's an epizootic among rodents, and the bacillus blocks the stomach of the fleas. The flea then bites the new host repeatedly, and the bacillus is regurgitated. Inside the human body, the bacillus heads to the nearest lymph node, and swellings or boils, known as buboes, begin to appear. The lymph nodes, of course, are in your neck, under your armpits, and in your groin. Roughly half the people who catch it die, and death comes usually in about a week. This is especially prominent, this form, in spring and early summer because fleas are particularly numerous at that time. The second form of the disease is pneumonic plague. Here the lungs are the seat of the infection. Either you get pneumonic plague after bubonic plague, the bacillus, having caused bubonic plague, then carries on, reaches the lungs eventually via the bloodstream. So that's called secondary pneumonic plague, as you've already had the bubonic form. Or pneumonic plague itself is contagious. It's accompanied by coughing and sneezing. Someone else then inhales the bacilli directly into their lungs, and that's known as primary pneumonic plague. Now, if we were sitting in a room all together, this is the point at which somebody nervously coughs, and everyone turns around and looks at them. Death from pneumonic plague is inevitable, and comes within 2 days. The temperature of the lungs is perfect for the bacilli to multiply rapidly. This form of the disease is more prominent in winter and spring because of colds and flu and all those sort of respiratory conditions. What about death rates? Nationally, death rates in the Black Death are highly disputed, but most historians now settle on about 40 to 50% of the population of England. Dartmoor appears to have been very badly hit. The evidence we have isn't directly about mortality, but it all points in more or less the same direction. There are 3 main forms. We can look at the replacement of parish priests, for example, in the deanery of Morton Hampstead, which are the parishes from Ashburton up to Morton Hampstead. 75% of the priests needed to be replaced during the passage of the Black Death. The replacement of parish priests across Devon as a whole reveals a fascinating picture. And I've tried to map it for you here. Death rates, as shown by the diameter of each circle, seem to have been markedly higher in the south and east of the county, where plague, if you remember, spread first, but also seems to have held on the longest. So we can look at the replacement of parish priests. We can also look at Dartmoor's ancient tenements to get a sense of mortality. We can track the ownership of each tenement through a number of documents from the years 1345, when we have what's called a manorial extent, or a list of owners, through to 1351, when we have a rental, which is essentially another list of the owners or the tenants. So these are the inhabitants of the ancient tenements in Dartmoor Forest in the mid to late 1340s. There are 45 people listed there. It's not necessarily the details of the names that I wanted to focus on. It's the numbers, really. And out of those people, these are the ones who survived in 1351. So roughly 2/3 of these tenements had new owners by 1351. A third bit of evidence we got for mortality on Dartmoor relates to the manor of South Tean that we looked at right at the beginning. The number of landless people paying to live on the manor dropped by 68% during the Black Death. Now, there are a number of possible explanations for this, but the reeve of the manor of South Tean was in no doubt why. It was, he said, because the greatest part of the landless are dead through the pestilence. Now, none of these three, the replacement of parish priests, the ancient tenements, or the landless on the manor of South Tean, none are straightforward calculations of mortality, but all are suggestive of the vast scale of the catastrophe facing people in the late 14th century. The immediate effects of the passage of the Black Death were dramatic and sometimes grotesque. We're told that churchyards were full. The smell was terrible. One chronicler said that such a stink arose that it was barely possible for anyone to pass a churchyard. Some families were completely devastated as well. The only manorial account roll we have from a directly cultivated demesne at that time for Devon is for the manor of Allapeveril near Columpton. So it's slightly off Dartmoor, but the details it contains speak very clearly of the immediate devastation and change. This is a picture of it. You can see it says right at the top, it has an abbreviation in the little box for Allapeveril. We're told that heriots or death duties were received from 13 named tenants. We're told that some holdings remained completely empty by the 29th of September 1349. The costs of arable doubled over the year because the reeve noted of the dearth of men, the complete lack of men. Most young livestock perished. Their bodies are said to be like cadavers, completely wizened. And some parts of the economy, such as cheese making, were just abandoned in the summer of 1349. On Dartmoor, the initial social and economic impact was undoubtedly huge. Firstly, tin output. Although no figures for output survived for Devon at this time, in Cornwall, tin output in 1351 was just 20% of what it had been before the Black Death, and it didn't recover to pre-Black Death levels for 35 years. Secondly, lots of land fell into the Lord's hands. At Bovey Tracy, we hear in 1353 of tenements that had come into the Lord's hands through the death of tenants in the last pestilence. At Ashburton, there were still complaints about lost rents through tenant deaths 20 years after the Black Death. Some farmsteads were completely abandoned. Several of the ancient tenements on Dartmoor remained in the Lord's hands throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries. And this is a reconstruction of one such tenement, a tenement called Black Firs's, which was in existence in 1348. We know the names of the tenants. So you can see on the map, it was divided into 3 tenants: Robert Keith, Julius Robb, and a man just called John. But by 1349, it was completely abandoned. So this lies just south of Dunnabridge Pound that we saw earlier, just on the banks of the Dart, just where the Swinbourne joins it. Dartmoor, of course, is famous for its deserted settlements, especially Hound Tor in Mannerton Parish. Similarly, some manorial surveys elsewhere, as for the Bishop of Exeter's manor of Staverton, highlight the destruction of tenements and waste. So was this then a deserted landscape? Well, I don't think it was, no. In the longer term, the Black Death ushered in a period of significant economic and social change, creating conditions in which Dartmoor and other areas of Devon began to thrive. 3 remarkable lists of tithes paid by the parishioners of Widcombe, Ashburton and Staverton show that in the 1380s, most scattered farmsteads in these parishes were occupied and productive in terms of arable cultivation at that time. Lords often attracted tenants on new terms, sometimes through a reduction in rent, sometimes by offering land on free rather than unfree terms. At Bovey Tracy, 2/3 of tenants had been unfree in 1326. By 1399, this had dropped to a quarter of tenants. In fact, this was a period of growing levels of consumption, with more land per head, more employment opportunities and rising wages. People's surplus income rose and patterns of consumption began to change. They ate more meat and better quality bread. They drank more ale. They wore better quality cloth, and they bought more household goods. I mentioned more employment opportunities. This was especially the case for women, often as servants. The story of one Plymouth servant, though, is wholly exceptional and concerns the birth of the Black Prince's first son, a chap called Edward of Angoulême. This is the document which tells the story of a woman by the name of Eleanor Bowl, who was the servant of Roger Boson of Plymouth. And she was, or became, the midwife, the obstetrice, as it's called in the document, of the wife of the Black Prince, who was the first son of Edward III. And the document tells us how she is paid 45 shillings to travel to Gascony in France, a journey which took her 30 days there and back. She was also given 20 gallons of wine for that period. And we're told that a horse met her at Bordeaux and took her to where the prince and his wife were based in Gascony, and there she acted as the midwife for the firstborn of the prince. What's really nice about this document is towards the end, in the penultimate line, it tells us how the Black Prince sent out letters to various people asking for a festivationem magnum, a great feast, presumably to celebrate the birth of his firstborn son. So you've got this Plymouth girl, this woman called Eleanor Bowl, holding in her arms the baby who should have become the next King of England. Sadly, he died 6 or 7 years later from a further outbreak of plague, and it was his younger brother, Richard, who eventually became Richard II in 1377. The impact of rising surplus wealth and increased consumption per head on the economy of Dartmoor and the surrounding area was immense. Tin output from Devon, which is effectively Dartmoor, rose from below £100,000 in weight in the 1370s to over £500,000 in the early 16th century. This was not just about tin per se, but about pewter. As a Venetian visitor to London put it in 1500, even persons of low degree eat off that fine tin, which is a little inferior to silver, i.e. pewter. Native cloth production also expanded with distinct clothworking areas, not least between Totnes and Kingsbridge, and more fulling mills on, for example, the River Bovey. Notably at Shaw Prior, the value of the fulling mill increased in the late 14th century, while the value of the corn mill declined. The number of sheep rose significantly as well, as these figures from the Bishop of Exeter's estate indicate. The number of cattle grazing and coming on to Dartmoor from the lowlands each summer also rose in the late 14th century, from 9,000 on the eve of the Black Death to over 13,500 head of cattle by 1362. There was clearly money to be made, and demand for better quality goods may well have prompted changes in the nature of goods. I think you can trace this in the pottery that you can find in your gardens. This is some medieval courseware made at Totnes. Two examples. The first on the left-hand side from the late 13th and early 14th century is very coarse. You can see the bits in it very clearly. Whereas the one on the right is much finer. It's got a much smoother surface, and it's also more consistently baked in a kiln. It's got a very consistent colour, unlike the earlier example. And I wonder whether it's demand that's driving this, people having more money in their pockets, and potters responding by making finer coursewares. But with opportunities for making money, of course, came discontent and dispute. The most striking feature of the courts for Chagford from 1431 to 2 is quite literally the number of acts of violence. These incidents sometimes didn't escalate beyond the use of hands, but weapons were often mentioned: daggers, scaffold poles, fork handles, which rather takes us back to the two Ronnies, and even weighing scales were used in Chagford as a weapon. Despite some marginal land being abandoned, as the regional economy grew, so settlement on Dartmoor often bucked the national trend in the 15th century and expanded. Just got two graphs on your screens now. On the left-hand side is a chart for the population of England, and you can see how it declines in the middle of the 14th century, but then flatlines really between 1350 and 1500, 1550, and if anything goes down somewhat. But on the right-hand side, I've just picked the example of Maniton, and you can see it follows a similar trend, falling down because of the Black Death during the middle of the 14th century. But instead of flatlining in the later Middle Ages, in the late 14th and 15th centuries, population takes off during that period. Even the high and very isolated settlement at Chalacombe continued to be occupied throughout the later Middle Ages. And Maniton is not unusual, certainly on this side of the moor, in terms of this demographic pattern. So late medieval Dartmoor, on the one hand, is famous for deserted settlements, not least Hound Tor, yet on the other was experiencing rapid population growth. Something doesn't quite add up. We tend to think of the inhabitants of Hound Tor village as being defeated by plague and by a deteriorating climate. Hound Tor is often portrayed as a retreat from an increasingly inhospitable environment, but maybe there's another explanation. Rummaging around in the National Archives, back in the days when you could rummage around in the National Archives, I found this, an account roll for Maniton dating to 1488 to 1489. It shows the, first I should say, you can see in the top left-hand corner of the document, it says Maniton there, just so that you know that I'm not making it up. What this document shows are leases for land across the manor, and by far the biggest is for Hound Tor, and that's right towards the bottom of the screen. It says, it's the second complete line up from the bottom. It says, and for 100 shillings from the rent of a size for John Smith for one messuage and a certain land and barton of Hound Tor. The messuage mentioned here may well relate to Great Hound Tor, but the barton includes Hound Tor Down, on which the deserted village sits. Did somebody spot an opportunity here for which they were willing to pay handsomely? I'm increasingly thinking that this opportunity may have been to do with tin. The lord of the manor after the Black Death was one Walter Dimmock, one of the most successful tin workers of the late 14th century, and remains of tin streaming are visible at a number of sites around the Hound Tor area. Perhaps the inhabitants of Hound Tor village were discouraged from staying, I'll put it, as happened in numerous cases elsewhere in England, particularly to do with sheep farming in that case. Indeed, in 1377, according to the Court of Common Pleas, the holdings of Walter Dimmock's widow in Hound Tor and elsewhere in Maniton were attacked, with property damaged, goods stolen, and a servant abducted. Perhaps Hound Tor then should represent not simply defeat and retreat, but instead a consequence of social change, of economic adaptation, and for some people at least, success. Just to try and pull it together and to conclude, regardless of how we interpret Hound Tor, the Black Death, devastating and horrendous though it was, boosted ultimately the economy of Dartmoor and Devon. That boost is still reflected in the built environment around us, particularly in churches. The 15th century saw wealth spent on new towers, new porches, rood screens, bells, and stained glass. And this is an example, it's the last slide, from St Michael's Church in Doddescombe Lee, a famous window called the Seven Sacraments, and these are two of them, one showing penance on the left, and on the right we've got a window showing last rites being administered to someone. What's very nice about that particular windows, you get a real view into this man's room. You can see the green coverlet on his bed. You can see the chair next to his bed, and you can even just see under the chair the checkered floor on which his bed and his chair lie. Indeed, on and around Dartmoor, the 15th century saw something of an industrious revolution, and that says a lot about the resilience of the people who lived in this region over half a millennium ago. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David. That's brilliant. I'm just going to turn the microphone on so you can hear me as well. So thank you. That was a really fascinating talk. It really brought that period of history to sort of light to us. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. So many sort of things that occurred to me. I'll leave off those for the moment, but I can see there's a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll put those straight to you. So Nigel, I think, has got quite a contemporary question to ask you. He asks, of those who survived Black Death, was it because of some form of natural immunity, or was it because people isolated themselves by moving away from infected populations? So has your research brought any of that out at all?
That's a really astute question, actually. I think the first response of people, to come to the second part of your question first, was to naturally social distance. I think that some people increasingly who saw the the wave of mortality, if you like, approaching, because news did reach settlements before the Black Death arrived. Some people did move out of the way. I think some people would have made for the woodlands, made for different settlements. If they were rich enough, I think they would have flown to a different part of their estate. So people did some people did naturally socially distance from the path of the plague. I suspect too that some people, and we see it today as well, that some people would stay and brazen it out. The question of natural immunity, I think, is really interesting, and there has been some research done into people's DNA, and the feeling is that there could well be some natural immunity, and that may well be why mortality rates from the Black Death or from plague in England, because plague kept cropping up every 10 years or so throughout the later Middle Ages, but mortality rates were much, much lower at that time. So I suspect there was some natural immunity. Secondly, the outbreak directly after the Black Death, which came in 1361 to 62, has become known because of what the chroniclers at the time said as the mortality des enfants, the mortality of children. And this is, I think, because it's 12, 13 years after the Black Death, and people who were alive at the time of the Black Death and survived it may well have built up some natural immunity, or already had it, but the children who were born subsequently didn't in many cases, and many children died in that first big outbreak in 1361 to 2. So I think it's probably a combination of the both. It's only really in cities, particularly in Europe, that we've got evidence for strict social distancing as we would know it today, where people were told to stay apart, stay indoors, keep safe, protect the equivalent of the NHS. But in the countryside, that certainly wouldn't happen. And of course, this time, at least probably 90% of the population lived in rural areas. So yes, I would say it's a combination of the two things. But
Excellent.
yes, very good question.
Thank you. Thank you. And I suppose a bit like, I wonder if it's a bit like what we've gone through over this last year in terms of perhaps people from the cities actually coming out to more rural areas thinking they could perhaps sort of escape it there as a
Yeah,
possibility. Um,
personally, yeah, if they had money, I think they could. But
yeah.
if they didn't, they would stay put. Um,
Yes, and that would be the vast majority of us, wouldn't it? Most of us wouldn't have been the lords of the manor or the people with the money. Uh, right, let's see who else. I've got a question here. I think uh, oh, someone stay behind has said, was there any treatment at all? So obviously I think that came about. You showed those two slides of the tenements, and that was quite striking, really, sort of like the impacts, because you can hear figures like 60%, and sometimes they don't perhaps mean so much. But when you see a sheet of paper and you suddenly see it full of names, and then you suddenly see it sort of only with a handful of names on, that really brings it home. And then in the chat, I think that made stay behinds think, was there any treatment? Did they try anything? Were there any things that worked that you know?
well, the basis of medicine in the early 14th century, so when in the run up to the Black Death, was based very much on ancient texts. So they still very much believed in the four humours, and so bloodletting was seen to be the first course of action. Um, you and of course that may well have weakened people rather more than the desired effect. Um, there were various more intriguing forms of treatment. Sometimes it would involve some poultices being put on buboes. There was a one which I've seen the recipe for from the 15th century, which involves pigeon dung, which again might not have helped. But I think again there's a sense of people eyeing money making opportunities here, and of course this is a time when all medicine is effectively private. Um, so if you were a physician and they were right at the top of the tree in terms of the medical profession, or if you were an apothecary who was slightly lower down but would have had very rich customers in a town, you would have tried to sell all sorts of things. And so we do see lots of things being ground up and sold as the solution to this, some of which were factual in terms of they actually existed and what was being sold, some of which were fictional. So there's one recipe that includes the ground up horns of a unicorn. But of course, if you had the money, you might think, well, I'll definitely have that. Um, but I think what's really interesting about the Black Death is how it, in a sense, can be seen to gradually kickstart not just the medical profession into seeking out and finding out more about people and how their bodies work, but also urban authorities saying we ought to take more control over things like the hygiene of cities. People lived pretty filthy lives, but by about 1400, particularly in Italian cities, you start to see municipal authorities bringing in sanitary arrangements, hospitals being made slightly more sanitary, and taking things forward in that sense. Medically, the group that really emerges during this period are the surgeons. They were definitely a step down from physicians. Physicians were university people, they had their heads in books. Surgeons actually dealt with real people. And I think they, during this period and in the years that followed the Black Death, they learned a huge lot just by examining people. and you see treatises being written in the 1360s and 1370s, including in England, by people who have examined lots of bodies and are starting to report what they see, and I think learning hugely from it. I mean, it's not really until the late 17th and into the 18th centuries when you start to see people forging links about what might actually be productive in terms of dealing with plague. But I think these are the early stirrings of that movement.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well, just talking about the medical side of things, because certainly when you read a lot of historical kind of fiction, they do tend, everybody seems to want to avoid the physicians with all their bloodletting, and it is the sort of the perhaps the more herbal remedies and the sort of the more kind of country care that people are seeking out, and perhaps some of that more based in more the real world, perhaps, rather than books about humours and things.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
excellent. Okay, just moving on. Just we've got a few more questions in the chat here. Rodri is interested. Well, has asked whether on Dartmoor were there any plague pits at all, or mass burial sites? Do we know of?
That is a really good question. Um, I'm just trying to think. I'm not sure that I do, but plague burials are going through an interesting time at the minute because for the last um, since the late 1990s, when there was a big excavation done in London at East Smithfield, and then going through the more recent excavations at Charterhouse, plague burials are becoming thought of as being generally uh, more ordered. Um, but I suspect that again, that is it partly depends on money, and that plague pits would have existed as well, and often um, uh, in some villages you can find a plague pit, and you can find ordered burials in the churchyard, and the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Um, Personally, I don't know of any on Dartmoor, but um, of course, the population levels on Dartmoor, although they were growing up to the Black Death, wouldn't have been as high as elsewhere in the country. But that's not to say that plague pits didn't exist.
Yeah, I suppose it's probably to do with how overwhelmed a community gets, isn't it? If they sort of have got the ability to sort of to bury people sort of in a fitting way, then they would do. But I suppose if they became overwhelmed, then they might be forced to do something a bit more dramatic like that. Okay, thank you. Let's see who else has got a question on the sheet there. I think we might have got through most of them. Let's see. Um, Someone's just saying, first time watching something like this, very informative, fascinated that Dunnabridge Pound dates back to the 1300s, as I only stood in there yesterday.
Oh,
So, uh,
fantastic.
so that's good timing, isn't it? And it's interesting as well. You touched on Chalacombe a few times today, and we had Mark Owen from Chalacombe Farm on
Oh,
Tuesday
great.
night. So a
Yeah.
little plug: if anybody wants to find out a bit more about Chalacombe Farm in the modern day, then that talk is on the YouTube channel as well, so you
Mhm.
can have a little look at that. Um, and Marie, who is where's Marie? Marie's watching this from Oregon in the US,
Oh.
and so she's just saying that she's really enjoyed learning about this and about Chalacombe Farm. Um, has really appreciated this in-depth look at the plague through the lens of Dartmoor. and also a little plea for us to sort of keep on doing some of these online talks as well, because I think at the beginning I was quite excitable about the idea that we might be able to do some more face-to-face things as well. But I think Marie, I think we really can see the value in being able to reach out to lots of people by doing these kind of talks. So yeah, if we can continue to do them sort of like once a month or once a couple of months, then I think we'd really like to do that as well. It's tapping on our resident experts to share their research and things. I mean, I think what's fascinating from what you've told us, David, is just the painstaking detective work that you have to do in order to get this. To be able to quote a percentage or a figure, then that's a lot of documents that you've gone through and deciphered and pulled bits out. Yeah, I'm always in awe of sort of this painstaking research that has taken years and years, but is distilled down into a short talk like this. So yes, I think sometimes as a layperson, you perhaps don't always appreciate the amount of work that goes into it. A question though from me about the sheep. You sort of said that sheep in this going to the early 16th century, they just sort of increased. And was that because there was an opportunity, so there weren't people living upon in the land, so they could fill the landscape more easily without having to move people on, or was it more to do with geopolitics and and the various things going on externally that we had to look to our own trade in wool and things?
Yeah, I think there are two things going on with sheep. One is if you think that there are um, generally across the country fewer people, then costs of um, uh, the cost of doing arable cultivation increase significantly. Arable is very labour intensive during this period. No combine harvesters, etc. Everything's done by hand, and you need a lot of people to do it. At the same time, because of the fewer people nationally, the price of corn from the 1370s comes right down. So the prospect for arable farmers is not looking very bright from the late 14th century onwards. On the other hand, because people have more money, they're spending money on new clothes and that sort of thing. There is much more demand for wool, and throughout the 15th century, in certain areas of England, and Devon is one of them. Gloucestershire is another, Suffolk is another. You see this a great rise in the native cloth industry, and wool being shorn to be used in the English cloth industry, rather than just being exported across to Flanders. And again, I think that's driven by demand. Um, so it's those twin pillars really.
Yeah.
You know, partly agriculture, very labour intensive to do arable. If you're looking after sheep, it's less labour intensive. It is still, yeah, there are still very important jobs to do, but it's less labour intensive. But the price of wool is going up at the same time that the price of corn is going down, and in the end, it's an economic thing.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that. That's it's always difficult to sort of try and unpick all the sort of the strands that sort of feed into these things. I've got a couple more questions that have come in as we talk. MK Mo Parrot has said, if all the burial grounds were full because of the Black Death, where were the victims buried? Um, uh, can you answer that? Or is that still a bit more like the one we asked before?
Yeah, it's. I think that I mean there would have been in some parishes. What you find is that in a rural parish, that if more space was needed for burials than could be managed by the church, and um, a new plague pit was needed, then they would look towards the parish boundary, somewhere away from the centre of the village, and dig a pit there. Um, if you are in a city, then again you'd look outside the city walls. This is why in London you've got these big plague pits at East Smithfield, at Charterhouse. These are places outside the city walls. So if you think of where places like Aldgate are, and anywhere with the name Gate, that's defines the city walls. The Tower of London is where it meets the Thames, and Charterhouse, East Smithfield are just outside the city walls. So where there was space, sometimes land might be gifted to a municipality to put a burial ground on. But there was space. It was a question of finding a field in a rural area towards the parish boundary that was less productive than anywhere else, and I think you'd put it there.
Okay, excellent, thank you. I hope that answers your question, Mo. Um, I've got one that I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer, but I'm going to put it to you and see if you can.
That's a challenge.
Yeah, it is a challenge. Mirth 2401 has said in Russia they're facing the problem that plague bodies which were buried under ice are coming up, while the plague bacteria is still alive. Then I suspect that's beyond your. That's more
Ah,
microbiology, isn't it? I think maybe.
well, do you know the first? It's going back a few years now, not to give away any secrets, but the first course I did in adult education about the Black Death, um, uh, I had a room full of people, one of whom it turned out was a microbiologist, and I started talking about Yersinia pestis, and he said, "Well, I can go outside and find you some if you like." I said, perhaps I think not in terms of sort of safeguarding
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. I'm not sure that's going to be allowed. But he basically said, look, there is Yersinia pestis in the soil, and if you grub around under a hedgerow, you will come across some. But the big difference, he said, is that in order for it to be problematic, it's got to be in in a much more concentrated form. Um, so it still exists, but it's very diluted, and shouldn't be causing a problem. Um, Sometimes you do see plague emerging in the modern world, and there have been examples. I think the last outbreak was I think it was one in 2018. There was one in 2017 in Madagascar. We saw it in India in the 1990s. You said there was a lady from Oregon. I think there was a case in Oregon in 1984. And it's sometimes uh, uh, prairie dogs, cats sometimes been scratching in an area of soil. So the plague bacillus does still exist, but it is be very, very unfortunate and rare if you found it in a significant concentration. So yeah,
Excellent.
it is
Well,
there.
I thought I was putting you on the spot there, and you turned it around. And it feels to me it's probably this sort of the subject or the topic of a new Netflix drama, doesn't it? Really, it's where sort of a cat scratches an ice body that sort of turns. Yes. Anyway, we won't go down there. Um, Steve Metcalf says, "Do about the research says, do wills of the period give any insight into the impacts of the plague?" So, you've sort of touched on a few sources today, but are you able
Yeah.
to find wills and things which help with this kind of research?
Um, for Devon, sadly not, as a result of the bombing in the Second World War. Um, uh, Most of the wills produced locally were lost. Um, in parts of the country where wills do survive, um, you can reconstruct, if you like, yeah, rather as we do today. You can look at the excess deaths. So, in other words, in a particular city, you can say that there were 20 wills produced in 1348, but actually, um, uh, a certain proportion more, whatever that may be, in 1349. So you can start to look at how mortality shifts in that way. I think you can. I think some do still survive for Exeter, um, but as I say, the majority for Devon, I think no longer do. Um, wills are something they do exist for the 14th century. As I said, you can find cities on which you can base that sort of study, but they become much more common in the 15th century. So, as a 14th century instance, you're looking at the top layer of urban society. Very much it hasn't yet percolated down further than that. So there are definitely things um, that can be done with wills, and wills always contain lots of interesting bits and pieces of information. Sort of glimpse into someone's life almost through a keyhole, sort of looking into the room of their life. Um, but as I say, they become more abundant a little bit later, and we've been very unlucky in this part of the country.
Excellent, thank you. I hope that answers your question there. Okay, I think we've got one last one. I think that will tie us in nicely. Zoe Bowman saying, is it possible that the lease at Hound Tor relates to the isolated longhouse north of the village alongside the right of way? Uh,
Do you mean Hound Tor 2? Um,
um, yeah, I mean, I don't know.
yeah,
I'm unclear.
yeah,
Zoe, so if Zoe's got fast fingers, maybe she'll type in which bit.
yeah. It's what's very difficult with that lease is it it just talks about the Barton and Messuage of Hound Tor, but it's being leased for 100 shillings, which is a huge amount of money, £5 in at that time, which would have been an enormous amount of money. Um, it would have been the old manorial centre of Hound Tor, which I suspect was at Great Hound Tor. Um, but if it included the Barton land, we know that, or we now know, I think, because of the work of the Moor Medieval group, that the settlement of Hound Tor village itself um, can be dated to the 1230s, and was part of a manorial extension of its resources. So I suspect the later lease would include that land. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
Zoe has said it is Houndsall 2 she's talking about as well.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So it would, I think it would include Hound Tor too, but it wouldn't relate only to it. I suspect. Partly, I think just the sheer value of that land. It's much more than many other of the tenements around Manhattan at that time. Um, so something peculiar is going on. Haven't got to the bottom of it yet, but you're absolutely right to ask questions because um, each question is really very helpful, and everyone thinking about it may help to get to the bottom of it. But there's just something peculiar going on there. But it would include Houndtor too, but I don't think just relating only to it.
Fantastic. So I hope that helps, Zoe. Thank you to everybody. I think we'll draw a line under the questions there. Um, that's been a really fascinating add-on to the talk as well, just to sort of hear all these different questions come through.
Yeah,
Uh,
brilliant.
if people are really interested in this sort of period, then there are a number of things that we've produced over the years as part of the Moor Medieval Study Group. There are two films on YouTube. There's Living and Dying on Dartmoor, which features a certain Mr. Stone in that, and there is also what's the name of the other film that looks particularly at Hound Tor?
Medieval Hound Tour, a contested landscape.
Yes, so that touches on what you've been talking about in terms of sort of
It
uh,
does.
the rioting and unrest as
Yeah,
well, doesn't it?
it
And it
does.
and it even has a little tiny cameo from me in it as well.
It's worth watching for that alone.
Yeah, it's a blink and you miss it, and so I don't spoil all the interesting stuff that goes on. But yeah, those two films are well worth watching, finding out a bit more about it. There's also a talk about North Hall Manor as well, sort of online that we did last summer as part of the first lockdowns, and
Could I just mention the more medieval book too? Oh, you've got
I
it.
was
Ah,
literally just about to say
yes.
that. So we're on the synergy there. You talk about it. I'll hold it up.
Well, this is the book which was produced by the more medieval study group, and it contains um, an overview of Dartmoor from uh, particularly the Saxon period up to the early 16th century. And what is really special about it is that it was contributed to by lots and lots of members of the more medieval study group. Um, and it has a narrative through it that runs through the period, but has the work of the volunteers sort of highlighted in boxes all the way through the book. And it's still available at West Country Books in Newton Abbot, which has a website as well as a bookshop.
Excellent. Well, that's a fantastic plug, isn't it, for that? And it is a fantastic read. Um, there is some really fascinating research in there, and a lot of what David's talked on. You'll find sort of extra stuff to sort of fit in with that, and I think some similar illustrations. I think certainly some of those Salter ones as well in there, aren't there? So
Oh,
yes, so lovely. So that's great. So we've done the book, we've done the films, we've had the talk. It's fantastic.
that's
So
actually right.
yeah, so I'm just going to before I do my final thank yous. I'm just going to sort of tell you all about next week. So we are sort of halfway through the Heritage Festival. So next week we are in the company of Tony Clark, who's going to be talking about Dartmoor and Defence of a Nation, looking at the military on Dartmoor. So that'll be a fascinating talk. And then we've got Andy Crabb, the National Park archaeologist, on Thursday, who's going to be talking, trying to give a talk about the history of Dartmoor through 10 objects. So you know how archaeologists love to sort of find an object and then sort of extrapolate from it. Obviously, historians, take a lot more data and everything to build their picture. So we've got all that coming up, and as I say, there's loads of things online if you want to actually find out more and go back over some of our old talks and things like that. And that really just leaves me to say thank you to David once again on behalf of everybody. I see a few thank yous coming in here, so thank you, David. A fascinating talk as ever, really, really interesting. Lots of great feedback here through this. So yeah, thank you to you. Thank you to everybody else who's joined us this evening from wherever you are. It's been great to have your company tonight. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you at the next talk in our little virtual world. But until then, good night, everyone, and take care. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye now.
Cheerio.